All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another live discussion here on Colin's Corner. Today, my buddy Dr. L and I are going to be discussing in a spoiler free fashion Tigana. And we'll get into a little bit more about how this discussion is going to go and why we even ended up here together. But first, I'm going to give my buddy Dr. L here a minute just to introduce himself and let everybody know where you guys can find him here on YouTube and elsewhere. So, Dr. L, you want to give everybody a little introduction?
Yeah, man. Well, first, thanks for having me. It's always a blast. We did this not too long ago on another book, but it was fun then. It's gonna be fun today. So yeah, Dr. L. My name's Logan. That's what the L stands for. And I have a YouTube channel, Novel Insights. I think my handle is at Dr. L _ reads, and that's also the same thing on Twitter as well. And yeah, my channel is primarily focus on kind of one main genre and then one main um, author group. So I like to focus on thrillers and I like to focus on self-pub and indie authors as well. And the self-pub indie authors, I kind of read all different genres. And then more of the traditional kind of books that I read and review and you'll see in the book hauls and things like that are thrillers. Though I do now venture out into the fantasy land, and I think my reading is the better for it. So I'm here to, have fun talking about one of my favorite fantasy books that I've read over the last year and a half. So that's it. Yeah, you can find me on those two places, not really anywhere else. And I love reading now. Just got into it not too long ago, and yeah, just excited to be here and chat about this book and about other things because we tend to get into other things too. So thanks for having me on and thanks for inviting me. Although I will say one thing just about this whole arrangement. Um, you are ever so kind to entertain my initial email and my initial reach out to see if you wanted to do something like this. So I want to say thank you for opening that email, giving it a response, and really driving us to get here at the end of it. So appreciate it.
Absolutely. We have Rogue here from Ireland. Good to see you, Rogue, as always. So for Rogue and anybody else watching this, I'll give just a little bit of a background of the culmination of how we're even here for this discussion. So Dr. L did reach out to me via email, and he is typically a crime thriller reader. And he was venturing out into the fantasy land of BookTube and decided to reach out to me, of all the wonderful fantasy booktubers that are out there, and do a kind of collaboration where, we read a crime thriller book that was kind of on his TBR that he's been excited about, and then read a fantasy book that was on my TBR that I'm excited about, and then kind of have a discussion about what reading a crime thriller as a fantasy reader was like, and vice versa for a crime thriller reader reading a fantasy book. And we had a wonderful discussion on Dr. L's channel that he just posted yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Where we discussed his book, which was the first book in what was the series called?
Oh gosh,
the
Atlantis trilogy, maybe.
The Atlantis Gene was the first book in the trilogy, right. And we had a wonderful discussion that was primarily focused on that book and our experience with that. And we did touch a little bit about Tigana and make some comparisons, which I'm sure will carry over to this video. But anyways, the primary focus of this is going to be our experience together reading this book, and specifically Dr. L's experience as primarily a crime thriller reader, dipping his toes into the fantasy waters. So this is going to be spoiler free
the best
for
we can.
The plot as best we can. We may touch on some specific characters and some specific things that happen so that we can discuss it. But before we get going, I'm just gonna read the blurb from the back of Tigana for those of you that haven't read it yet. So if you've never read Tigana, you're safe to be here. Mm-hmm. For the most part, you might get a tiny spoilers, but we will do our best to not spoil any major plot points. So without anything further, this is the blurb from the back of Tigana. So Tigana is the magical story of a beleaguered land struggling to be free. It is the tale of a people so cursed by the black sorcery of a cruel, despotic king that even the name of their once beautiful homeland cannot be spoken or remembered. But years after the devastation, a handful of courageous men and women embark upon a dangerous crusade to overthrow their conquerors and bring back to the dark world the brilliance of a long-lost name, Tigana. Against the magnificently rendered background of a world both sensuous and barbaric, this sweeping epic of a passionate people pursuing their dream is breathtaking in its vision, changing forever the boundaries of fantasy fiction. So there's the blurb, and I think a good place for us to start would just be overall thoughts. What was your initial gut reaction upon closing the either physical or virtual cover of Tigana, and getting the whole of the story? What did you think, Dr. L?
Yeah, so good question. So let me. I'm gonna do three things. One, before I answer that question, I did just want to mention why I reached out to you in the first place.
Okay.
So the reason, like you mentioned, of all the fantasy booktubers, the reason is because whenever you gave book reviews and discussions and things, and some others do this as well. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say you're the only one, but I liked the seriousness that you took with it, and so it wasn't a video of a whole bunch of jokes and that kind of thing. And so I was kind of wanting to do a buddy read where we had serious discussions about it, and I was like, who can I be confident would take this seriously? And I don't know at all. And so that's why I chose you. I thought you did, you took your reviews and your approaches pretty serious. And that's exactly what we've essentially done. So I guessed right, I guess. But the book, I do want to make one quick comparison to the previous book. So I did a little bit of stat checking on this. The average page length for Tigana's chapters were like in the low to mid 30s. Okay, so I think it was around 33 to 34 pages. The average length in the Atlantis gene for the chapters, I think was 4, give or take a couple pages. So I can't remember if it could have been as high as 7, but I think it might have been closer to 4. So we're talking about the average chapter length for Atlantis gene was 10% of what the chapter, or 15% of what the chapters were in Tigana. So going from that book to this one, I read both physical copies, and this one was, it required more commitment. That being said, I'm glad I read it because it kind of allowed for a little bit more of an intimate experience. And this book overall was a book that had, I'm assuming this is what we would call epic fantasy. Is this epic?
Yeah.
Okay. Because
I would consider this epic fantasy.
Yeah, because it involved the only lands we really know of. And then it also had this other realm. So the Ember Knights was kind of this, it wasn't the same as the physical experience of the rest of kind of the book setting. It was this, I don't know what you'd call it, but it was this kind of other realm or this other dimension to the reality that they were experiencing. So I considered it epic because the only setting we knew of, it incorporated all of it. The plot encompassed all of it. So it was very large scale. It did, resemble its thickness for me. I read shorter books. This is my longest book to date to read. And at first, when I first started reading it, very character focused at the beginning. And once I got to the plot, I thought I'm in it, right? I am absolutely in this book because the plot is essentially you have, like it says, this evil ruler, and then you only know that based on the blurb that you read that somebody's got to try to stop or topple this evil ruler. And so I thought that plot setup, when I read it, I did not get that from the blurb. The blurb, I thought, made it sound like the name Tigana was going to play a much, much larger role. And it did play a central role, but it wasn't as large as I got from the actual book. And the actual plot that you kind of discover in the book is in my opinion, a much more fun and interesting kind of plot. So the overarching scope of the book is huge. It's broad, it's intriguing, and it's just an extreme invitation to get you in to read the book and be committed to the characters and the plot. So that's kind of my overall kind of thoughts before I get into specifics about people, settings, events, things like that. So I loved this book. This is my one of my top fantasies. And I will just want to preface this. As I was reading this, I read a couple other fantasy, or I listened to a couple other fantasies on audiobook in the meantime. And so if I make some comparisons, just excuse my lack of diversity in the fantasy that I've read. So I will make some comparisons with some of the other ones I read, because those are really the only similar epic fantasies that I've read. So just want to throw that out there. Mainly I'll make a comparison in a little bit to Mistborn, but
okay.
Yeah.
Rogue says this is definitely the most fantastical of his books I've read, and I figure it would be probably a good idea to let you guys know. It's probably pretty obvious that this is the first GGK book that Dr. L has read. This is also the first GGK book that I have read, so I have no other comparisons to other GGK books. But I obviously have quite a vast list of comparisons to other fantasy books. And one of the things that I think was interesting, as I was going through this back the second half, because we read Dr. L's book, The Atlantis Gene, first. And one of the things that I was thinking of that I wanted to ask you about was, because I'm kind of used to this, and maybe, I don't know if desensitized is the right word to it, but when I first started, so I began reading fiction again for fun. Probably, I think it was either 2019, late 2019, 2020. And one of the things that I had to come to learn how to do, especially with the fantasy genre, was suspend my disbelief and be willing to trust the author and believe in this sense of magic, this sense of wonder, this sense of other, because I feel like when I wasn't reading fiction for such a long time, my brain had kind of just divulged into a more just analytical, I don't know if it's nihilistic or just like too mature to be like, oh, that could never happen. And when you're reading fantasy or science fiction, and a lot of other genre fiction, it requires the reader to be willing to suspend their disbelief. And I think that multiple things have to happen for that to be successful. I think you have to have a willingness to suspend your disbelief and not be hypercritical because you picked up a fiction book and it's about a magical world with wizards and, sword and sorcery.
Yeah.
But I think the other half of that is largely up to how talented the author is in sweeping you away in the story and not really giving you too many lulls in the action and in the story to think too critically about it. So as somebody who reads a crime thriller, which primarily they take place in cities and places that are familiar to us, and they are with people and don't often have supernatural aspects to them or magic or mind control, things like that are typically you might find in a fantasy book. What was your experience reading a fantasy book? Did you have any problems suspending your disbelief? Were you swept away by the story? Were you bought into this magic that was happening in the land, or were you thinking analytically and critically about it and being like, that would never happen? I wondered what your experience with that was like.
Yeah, and so I didn't think about this until you just brought this up. But I'm glad you took a long explanation of kind of what you're getting at. Gave me time to think. I'd say that there's three things. So one, it was not hard for me at all. In fact, I'd say that the crime thrillers, because they kind of have a duty to be realistic, sometimes it's easier to pick up on the lack of realism in those. So it's easier for me to say in those kinds, like, oh, that would never happen, right? You have, 3 bullets left in the gun and there's 3 bad guys and you just happen to hit all of them where a single shot takes them all down at one time and you're rolling and jumping off a cliff and things like that. So that's kind of like that takes more of a suspense of disbelief than this does. Because at least in this, I know there are unexplainable things that are going to explain what's going on. And so that's easy for me to kind of pick up on and completely buy into. The second thing I'd mention, well, I guess that's the two things. It wasn't hard at all. I think some crime thrillers actually require that more than this one. And then lastly, I grew up with my brother watching wrestling, WWE, and all that kind of stuff. So if I can suspend disbelief for that, I can suspend disbelief for anything. It was easy for me to buy into and really enjoy that kind of stuff growing up. And so this pales in comparison to what's required in watching and following wrestling. So
That's a fair comparison, because really WWE is just theater at a very high level, right?
Right.
That's cool, because I think I take that for granted sometimes, and it rears its head whenever I'm like discussing a book I'm reading with my wife out loud, and I'm like, "Oh, this sounds pretty crazy," but I never usually think that when I'm reading. Because I was telling her about Tigana. One of the things that this book I think did really well was, even in that small blurb that I read at the beginning of this, it hooked me. I was like, "Oh, that's a really cool concept."
Oh, really?
Because while this book, and we'll talk about this a little bit, I think we mentioned this word, which I guess isn't a word that's tossed around as often in the discussion of crime thriller books, but we talked about the word tropes, which is pretty common, I think, when discussing fantasy and science fiction and genre fiction in general, because there are certain, and I think that crime thrillers probably have their versions of this, which you can touch on, but the tropes of fantasy that most people are familiar with, are the chosen one, are a small band of people, kind of like a found family becoming a thing and working together to achieve a goal, and obviously encountering difficulty, and oftentimes there being one big baddie that needs to be taken down. These are things that are familiar tropes for authors in this genre to use. And the fun thing is to see how people like UGK and other really talented authors in the genre are able to spin it and make it uniquely their own.
Right.
Even down to like our main, I would consider our main character in this to be Devin, and he's a minstrel or a bard. And when we first started this book and we realize, what he is, and that he's joining this troupe, this traveling troupe of minstrels. Even historically, minstrels and bards are very prominent and important, and especially in like medieval times, to like carry on stories and get news around the land. But I've never followed a minstrel or a bard as the main character, and I thought that was a really fun idea to kind of see how they were brought together. And obviously, we can't get too into spoilers, but there was a reason that this specific troupe got brought together.
Right.
But I'd like to ask you, did any of these, can you think of any tropes like I mentioned for fantasy that happen in crime thriller books?
Oh, yeah.
Or think about, talk about maybe some of the things that Guy Gavriel Kay does in this book that you might have been familiar with just being in the fantasy genre?
Yeah. So, I think that's a good question. And of course, there's definitely going to be tropes in all genres, because there's going to be, whether it's driven by sales or not, but there's going to be the stories that resonate and that sell the most, that kind of develop into be the kind of primary ones. But and just real quick, just so that anyone who is not a fantasy reader, the group minstrels and bards are essentially musicians and storytellers, right? So if you're not familiar with those terms, so there's tropes for sure. There's the cat and mouse trope that's really, really common. So you have the detective chasing the criminal, right? That's really, really common. And so it's kind of this, is the detective, or CIA officer or FBI officer, that kind of thing, chasing the one main bad guy. You have the organized crime, like discovering a web of organized crime and trying to topple the cabal. Okay, you have that, which actually is very similar to this book. And then you well, because you don't have rulers typically in crime fiction, but you will have like main bad guys, bosses of groups and things like that. So that's kind of similar to this. But then you also have the think of like Jason Bourne. So you have this someone with kind of this newly discovered or secretly uncovered set of skills, and essentially goes to fight corruption. So there's kind of fighting corruption from within. So you can be a part of it and you discover the corruption. That's a pretty common one. So like, whoa, I didn't realize that this organization I'm a part of is all corrupt. Now I got to play as an insider and try to get there. And then you have the outsider. Like I see from the, externally, I see this group and they're corrupted and I got to go and clear out the corruption. So there's a pretty good, someone shared it with me on Twitter. There's a pretty good explanation of the different kind of the very common stories in these kind of crime thrillers and crime fiction. And I can't remember how many there were, 4, maybe a little bit more than that, but it kind of talks about these and their you can actually see them in the way in which culture uses these stories. So it's not just across Western culture, but in Eastern culture, you see particular stories as well. And so there are those tropes, and I may be missing some, off the top of my head right now, but there are definitely those. This one I liked because you had 2 people who had to be toppled. You had 2 separate kind of powerful evil bad guys, and that was really fascinating. And personally, it was fascinating because before I was reading this, I am writing. I'm trying to write a little bit too, and my plot setup is, and you're gonna think I read this book before this, but I promise I didn't. But my plot setup is, it's essentially this band of people who go and try to settle a conflict, and in which there are 2 primary bad guys, and they have to take them out at the same time. And so when I was reading this, I was like, this is awesome. This is research for my for my story. Very, very similar. And so I'm not writing fantasy, but you can see how those tropes or those storylines can exist in both genres. The difference is mine takes place in, the present world, and there's no magic, but there's still the same kind of plot and idea development. And so it's kind of funny how that happens. I thought when I realized it, I was like, this is perfect for our discussion, because I can show exactly how a very, very similar plot can happen in fantasy as in a kind of a crime thriller or like an action thriller. So
cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, you made mention of which is this is something I didn't know about, which is I guess a theme of Guy Gavriel Kay is where the chapter length is very long. That's not something that's very uncommon in fantasy. I think that his were just a little bit excessively longer than even I'm used to. But it was interesting coming from the Atlantis gene, directly into Tigana, because it was such a vast difference in chapter length. But I think that one of the things you talked about is almost kind of tied into the reason that fantasy, just I think in general, lent itself to needing more pages and needing more chapter length. You touched on the beginning of this book being heavily character focused. And there's usually a couple of things happen, I feel like, in a lot of fantasy, where the author is forced to either bake into or take deliberate time to world build. And a lot of that can happen, I think, through learning about characters and maybe their past a little bit or what they're going through. But in fantasy, in specifically fantasy, because I've not read a ton of science fiction, I noticed there is almost always a portion of the first book in a series or the first part of a book that has to be taken to set up the rules of the world, to set up what type of world we are working with, what type of magic might exist in this world. You might not know how that magic works or how it affects people yet, but there has to be a lot of time taken to introduce the mechanics of the world, and characters a lot of times seem to be used to introduce these things. So as somebody who, and we talked about this too in your video on your channel, as somebody who doesn't often read fantasy, did you enjoy reading a more character focused narrative rather than a plot focused narrative? Because we talked about in Atlantis, Gene, how one of the things that kind of fell short for both of us was that the characters were not very gripping or unique and did not stand out as part of one of my favorite aspects of that story. So how did Tigana compare to the Atlantis, Gene, specifically, or just in general, to crime thrillers as a largely character focused narrative?
Yeah, good. That's a good question. You're right. We both definitely picked up on the characters in Atlantis, Gene were shallow. You kind of eventually get around to one of them, but even then, it still is nothing like this book. So I'm gonna give you a kind of a couple examples out of the Tigana book. So Devin and I think it's Catriona.
Yeah, Catriona sounds right.
Yeah. So you get this in the first couple chapters. You basically get this event that causes their tension throughout the rest of the book, and that plays into essentially how their decision making goes in for the rest of the book. It creates, this kind of an understanding of, while they're focused on the mission, they're also kind of sidetracked, focused on each other, and so you get that interplay that's set up pretty well at the beginning and kind of remains a theme with Devin as he goes down the plot line. And I thought that was a good example of a couple chapters before anything really starts to happen, a couple chapters focusing on a couple characters to set up a sustained tension throughout the book. You'll sometimes get that in crime thrillers, sometimes. The other thing is, I think that's a really good example that you don't get as much unless it's the antagonist. Sometimes in crime thrillers, they'll try to focus on the antagonist so that you can better understand who they are and why they do what they do. But it's the Diana chapter, the first Diana chapter, where you basically kind of take a break from the whole, or is it Dianara?
I think Dianara, but I knew who you were talking.
That's right. Yeah, Dianora. Sorry.
No, you're good.
You take a break from the rest of the plot, and you get a pretty long 30 to 40 pages dedicated to understanding who Dianora is and her experience. And in that story, you get a little bit of a contribution to the overall plot, but you really focus on her, and then it ties it in much later. In crime fiction, you don't get as much of, let's move the plot along, let's take a break from it, let's put a couple chapters dedicated to this one person with a little bit that's going to tie into the overall plot later on, and then let's kind of leave her alone for a while and then tie her in 3 chapters later in a much fewer words, but in a pretty major way, right? We find out exactly who Dianora is and her relation to the main characters. And so that's one of those where I don't know if you see it more in fantasy, but you don't see that as much in crime fiction. In crime fiction, it's the action, the plot, and the character development is it's in there sometimes, and it might be, or it's not. Except there are cases where books are going to do both really, really well. And so I just mentioned in one of the videos I did, the Killer Thrillers and Thriller Killers episode 2, the book Child 44. It's probably one of the best thriller books that I've read because of how it does everything extremely well. It provides the best backdrop to a character story. It provides the best character development, and the plot, the crime plot, is just done so well. It's one of the best books. It reads long. It reads epic. It's not an epic, of course. It's happening in one country, but it reads that way because of so much going on in that particular story. And it's one of those where you have a little bit of patience with it. So it's not just action packed all the time. You have patience, but there's just always something kind of pulling you in. And so it's a good example of when crime thrillers do character development really well, really well. So
cool.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little while ago that you wanted to make maybe some comments or some comparisons to make the case that maybe Tigana is a thriller in itself.
Thriller.
Do you want to expand upon that and maybe get into some of why you might think that?
Yeah. So before we started this, I told Colin I was going to try to convince him this is really a thriller book. So it has pretty cool thriller elements, which I'm also realizing that I don't think this is truly a thriller element. I think this is actually kind of a fantasy storyline, and this is why I compare it to Mistborn. But it's essentially, when I started reading it, again, I'm pretty new to fantasy, so when I started reading it, my thoughts are, magic, sword and sorcery, a lot of conjuring, a lot of mythical creatures, that kind of stuff. Not really. A lot of magic. Well, some magic, but the magic was used to kind of survive and stay alive for the most part until it was needed to do more. And there were definitely parts in that where it did more, but it really, the magic used was it was interesting how it was a liability at times. And I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying that, but it was a liability because in Mistborn, it's the same thing. In Mistborn, you really get similar ideas, which are if you use magic, it can be a liability to a degree, right? The detection of it and that kind of stuff. So the magic system itself is the fantasy part of it. Plus the lands are different; they're not the human world, and there are things that go on. Don't get me wrong, but you essentially have, hey, we have a people who are oppressed. We have a people who are abused. We have a people who are exploited and taken advantage of. We need to find the leader and find a way and plot a way to essentially topple the lead bad guy and then provide something better for the people. And so in a thriller, if you want to think of that, in like an organized crime thriller, it's kind of the same thing, right? This group is terrorizing people or killing people or whatever it is. And we have to find a way and plot a way to, topple them and take over them. So I think there's a kind of, the reason I say it might be a thriller within a fantasy is that it has some overlapping story elements. But the more I kind of think about it, it's not your typical thriller story. And the pace is what makes it not a thriller. Thrillers won't read like this in pace typically. Some do, some are a little bit more like this, but many don't. And the reason is because they don't have to set up and explain the landscape, the geography, the magic, the hierarchy structure, right? You can, if someone says a government, you can kind of understand, okay, they make rules, laws, regulations for people. Whereas if you say a leader, it's kind of like, okay, well, who do they lead? How far is their reach? What does it mean that they lead? Do they, is it a sanctioned leadership? That kind of stuff. So you have to kind of explain, I guess, a little bit more. And so GGK explained how things were set up. Like he had to give the background into how people came into power. Whereas if you say you're in the US and you have a president, it's like, well, I don't have to explain how that person came into power. If you do a dystopian novel, then yeah, you got to explain that. But if it's something like this, then it takes a little more explaining. So the pace is going to be quite different. But then I know there's fast-paced fantasy as well. Mistborn has always been described to me as a really fast-paced fantasy, so I get that too. But you're going to get a little bit less of this pace and yeah. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, you touched on a little bit of an interesting point, and it brought up a question that just kind of came to me, which you were talking about the magic in Tigana, and I believe this would be considered to fantasy fans a soft magic system. Okay. So it's kind of the difference is between a soft and a hard magic system primarily is that the soft magic systems in fantasy books often do not explain how and why the magic works. It lends a lot to the reader's sense of disbelief and just understanding that magic does happen, and maybe seeing the results of magic to create the sense of impending doom or wonder and awe at the power of something. And so in Tigana, we understand that there is magic. We understand that it can be very powerful with some people, and there can be some amazing or horribly devastating consequences when someone wielding massive powers of this magic um, chooses to exercise it. And I have not read Mistborn. It's actually sitting right there. I just
Oh, yeah.
bought it recently. I've not read any Sanderson, but from my general understanding, is Mistborn a more of what would be considered a hard magic system? Like, does Sanderson take the time to explain how and why the magic works? Are there rules to this magic that the people in the book are kind of learning alongside the reader, that you grow
Yeah.
to like learn and understand the magic system better?
Yeah, so I'm glad you're asking a non-fantasy fan to answer that question. So I'll do the best I can. um, it's not going to spoil this at all. But basically, people consume metals, and based on what metal they consume, they'll have a certain magic available to them, and it is ratioed. So the more you consume, the more the magic's going to last, or the more power you might have in the magic. And I've only read the first one plus some of the second one, so if it evolves, I can't explain that. And then the other thing is with that is, yes, a person's trained on the magic. And so you kind of, as they're trained, you get to understand how the magic exactly works, when to use it, when not to, strategies for using it. And then again, of course, which metal produces what kind of ability. So I don't know if that's a hard magic system. I can't answer that question because I haven't read enough fantasy, but it is explained. There are kind of rules around it, and you do get a good sense of where it comes from, to a degree, and
Okay.
who can use it. So who can use it is also explained.
That's interesting, and I think that this soft versus hard magic system is something that's a bit unique. Um, the Rogue says GGK and Sanderson make for a great contrast.
Oh, cool.
That's interesting because I've been kind of putting off reading Sanderson just because we talked about this a little bit in your video too. I know if I enjoy it, it's going to take over my life and perhaps my whole year of reading. But I've read enough fantasy to where I've kind of been able to formulate an opinion on this. And I was wondering, I'll get to eventually a question to ask you, but so I find typically I tend to enjoy the soft magic system a bit more because um for this book specifically, and I love reading all fantasy, but there was such a sense of wonder and awe and magic about this setting, about these characters, about this story, about their mission for me. It almost kind of took me back to like a childhood feeling of like just wow, this other world is so cool. And obviously that's one of the main reasons people read fantasy, but this book specifically just felt super magical to me and cozy in a way. Like the world was mean and there were bad things happening, but I love the settings of being in, pubs or traveling across vast, rolling hills of land and just mountains,
Yeah.
archers creeping in mountains, and like I don't know, this just felt um it just in the magic not being able to be understood.
Yeah.
I was scared, I was in awe, I was like on the edge of my seat for like a lot of these scenes that took a while to build up to. But what was your experience with that? Were you like, as you were reading this, were you questioning like, well, how the heck does this magic work? How is he so much more powerful than they are? And like, were you questioning that, or were you just kind of along for the ride and seeing what was going on with the characters?
Yeah. So this will I'll expose my naivete here. But for me, magic is always like someone doing this and then something happening. And that's it's a very, very a child's understanding of magic, if you will. Basically, it's just like making things operate under your control. That's kind of what I typically would say that was the anchor point for my magic. The first scene using magic in this book, I bought into it. I can envision exactly how that first scene happened in terms of the use of magic and what that would look like. And I thought it was such a cool depiction of the use of magic. And then once I realized that there was a consequence for using magic, I thought this is even better. So, if it's GGK's, I'll give Guy Gavriel Kay the credit here. His first scene made me like the magic immediately. At least, what is it? Do you say Alberico or Alberico, or how did you
I said
pronounce
Alberico in my head, but
it? Okay, I said Alberico in my head.
doesn't.
This is fun. We should go through all of them. No,
Yeah.
so yes, that Alberico is that at that instant I was like, I don't understand everything, but I understand a little bit, and I did want to know more. So I do want to know more. And so I'm not going to say what happened, but that particular scene I thought was just consuming in terms of how much I wanted to know more and how much I wanted to follow how this evolved. And it's not, the book is not consistent magic all the time throughout the whole thing. It comes and goes. But as far as your point about the geography, I did and really enjoy how the geography was used. So you have in one part of the story, the geography becomes a pinch point when they're traveling and they meet up with the people, the band of thieves.
Yeah.
And then geography played a big role at the very end as well. And so I really enjoyed that. And the cool thing too is you get this, the Guy Gavriel Kay keeps referencing the two moons throughout the whole book.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was kind of neat to kind of help remind you this is a different world. Right. So,
yeah.
So there's kind of some comments on both of those things, but the magic I was ready to buy in from the first scene. So I thought it was such a cool idea and depiction of what the capabilities were and what the consequences were, and a glimpse into what might come in the future. So, and how it worked a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, I think there's obviously things like this happen in crime thrillers and other books too, other mediums of fiction, where there almost has to be a limiting factor to someone's power for it to be believable.
Sure.
Or else, I mean, if there wasn't, then you get into the reader or the consumer asking those critical questions like, why don't they just do this then? And now there's an answer. Well, it's because they can't, or else this will happen. Right. So it helps to kind of, I guess box the super powerful people in and make it more believable. But,
because you do want to think that the people can be beaten somehow, even if you don't know yet how.
Yeah. I mean, you even go into, I think we can spoil the Lord of the Rings at this point, but there's detriments to the ring wearer, putting the ring on. So there has to be limiting factors with these things somehow. But well, we've kind of touched on a lot. Do you have anything other specific that you?
Oh yeah, I got questions.
Any other thoughts? Let's hear them.
I got questions for you. So the first question I have for you is, in the stories, the kind of fantasy that you've read, what is this most similar to other stories that you've read? Or does it really stick out? Because I'm kind of wondering, I've only read a couple, so I'm kind of like, what does a fantasy reader think about it?
So I would say most similar to, it reminds me more of classic fantasy. So things like Lord of the Rings, where there's a major quest and obviously a single character or group of characters that we're following throughout this whole thing. and usually it's the good guys. There are fantasy books, and I'm sure there's crime and thriller books where the main perspective or the main character you're following is the antagonist or the bad guy, and those can be fun. But to me, this book, I think the reason that I keep wanting to use the adjective cozy, it felt cozy to me because it reminded me of like classic epic fantasy and not modern fantasy, which I thought was great. It's been a while since I've read The Lord of the Rings. It's been a while since and I've not read a lot of classic fantasy, but it felt more like that than some of the other more recent modern reads that I've read. And I don't know if I have a direct comparison to an author or direct comparison to a specific series, but I guess my comparison would be that it was written in, I think, 1990. Is that right? Yeah, 1990. So that makes sense that it feels, I guess I compare it to a era of fantasy more, which would be more so the era of classical epic fantasy. And to me, that just takes me back to my initial mental schema of what fantasy is, what a fantasy book is, what a fantasy movie is.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why it felt cozy, because it had stops in little towns, and I could kind of picture what the town looked like, and it had, scenes in little pubs and little brawls between soldiers, and kind of the sword and sorcery aspect of archers and no modernized weapons, like guns or things like that. Like people were using daggers and swords and poisons, and that I think is more classic epic fantasy, and we could go into a lot of different reasons why that I feel that way. But there's not a way to get information to people quickly. You're still using like carrier pigeons or just having to travel by horseback. You can't pull a gun out and shoot somebody. Like there's a lot of hand-to-hand combat or archery or plotting to trap and things like that. So I think I would compare it to the era of classic fantasy more than like a specific author or specific series.
And I think you mentioned you posted at some point in time that reading this book has reminded you why you fell in love with fantasy in the first place, or something like that. So is that kind of what you're describing?
Yeah, every once in a while you'll just read a book where, it's just like, wow, this, like, it just kind of swept me off my feet from the beginning, kind of like you were, like the first scene with magic, like the setting, the characters, like everything. I was just like, wow, I feel like GGK just took me to another world. Like every time I open this book, I'm just in another place for a little while. And I think a lot of the reason that people read fantasy is to escape. A lot of the reasons people read crime thrillers are to be thrilled or to be caught up or to be duped by someone that's a creative writer that makes a plot where you can't find they're trying to get you somehow mentally, but you miss it. And then you're like, man, that was good. Well, fantasy a lot of times is like, I just want to be swept away somewhere else for a little while that doesn't feel at all like this. Didn't feel at all like our world. It didn't feel like there were many comparisons. Like you said, there were two moons and they were referenced frequently. There was an entire other religion that, kind of gets fleshed out a bit, and it felt real. It didn't feel like the author just threw this in cheaply to make it seem like, oh, it's a fantasy world, there must be another religion. No, it felt like the people, like it felt like a world that was lived in, with its own characteristics and its own culture. And that's hard to do I mean, it's a long book, but within 600 pages to make it feel like an entire, like multiple cultures were created and they all felt realistic, and an entire religion base was created. And so it kind of brought me back. Like Lord of the Rings made me feel that way. Like, wow, this just feels nothing like my world at all. Like it feels like a whole nother world to me. And Tigana did that for me.
Cool. Yeah, I think I agree. Again, not reading a lot of fantasy, I agree that this world was quite vivid. and it was easy to imagine. So without spoiling, my next question is, what are some of your favorite scenes in the book?
Favorite scenes.
Or favorite plot points, I guess, too.
When they, I can say this because it will be out of context completely, like you'd have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
But the service that they perform at and the song that Devin sings, that kind
Mm-hmm.
of everybody in the land now ties to him because he performed it so well. Like he like kind of made the song that wasn't his song,
Right.
and kind of like part of his legend. The aura that he created as a character, I think GGK did such an amazing job capturing that.
Mm-hmm.
To me as the reader, I felt like I was in that room when he was performing the song
Yeah.
and just listening to him, and how it affected the people in the audience, I thought was really cool. I thought that you mentioned the Ember Knights. That battle scene was really memorable and
Yeah.
unique. That whole kind of, I mean, that whole getting to that point with
Yeah.
that side character, I thought was very memorable, and just a cool, like it obviously was a diversion
Yeah.
from the main plot line, but it was one that I was totally okay with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's kind of, that was a weird one to me, because so I pronounced his name Baird.
That's what I
But
said too.
okay, so Baird essentially is kind of like this main character, and then that Ember Knights is kind of his plot climax almost.
Yeah.
Um, and then he, is kind of in the rest of the story, but differently than when he was in than the first part before the Ember Knights. So I thought it was really interesting how there are these kind of some of these subplots that play out, and there's this overarching plot. And again, it takes a lot of pages to do this, to do that pretty well, to flesh those things out. But yeah, that was the Ember Knights was really interesting, and at the end of it, when I read it, I was like, that was fun. But I'm still, I got to figure out how that plays in at some point.
Yeah, ready to get back.
Yeah. Um, what other scenes did you like? Because I would say I would not have guessed that your favorite scene would have been the performance.
Yeah, I don't know if it was like my
Well,
favorite.
one that stood out.
It
I wouldn't
stood
have guessed
out.
that
It
it
stood
stood
out
out.
in my. I don't know why, because I feel like he just did such a good job connecting to me as a reader and displaying like what that would have felt like um, in that moment. Obviously, the I think the end um, is an easy one, maybe a cheap one to talk about, but there is a bit of a twist that happens that I didn't see coming.
Yeah. Yeah, me either.
Maybe I could have. I mean, like, if I would have reread this or to reread this someday, maybe I'll see hints that GGK drops along the way, because in a lot of fantasy books, that is the case. Like in crime thriller books, like, oh, I could have got this if I like
Yeah.
really was thinking about it,
Yeah.
but I wasn't, and I was blown away by it, and I thought that was really cool and in an awesome aspect to this, because even if that twist wouldn't have happened, I still would have thought that the way that things wrapped up was pretty entertaining.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think do you have a specific favorite scene?
I mean, I got a couple, but
Okay. Well, let me hear yours.
all right,
How do they differ, I guess, from mine?
they're probably going to be easily to guess because I'm as a crime thriller, I like those elements of it, but not necessarily. Um, we have another person join. Um,
That's my buddy Rogier.
oh,
How's it going, Rogier?
how's it going?
Welcome. I don't know if you've read GGK, but we're discussing in a relatively spoiler-free way
Yeah.
Tigana. So welcome.
So yeah, so the couple scenes that stood out to me, and the things that I will say the ending I thought was good. So is one of those endings that doesn't ruin a book and doesn't undermine the rest of the book. Sometimes they can, but I thought the ending was really good, and I loved how the ending scene is it like a chapter long. That's pretty cool too. Sometimes
Yeah.
when I read crime thrillers, they're much shorter chapters, and the ending scene is a few pages of the last chapter, and I'm kind of thinking, I wish we spent more time in it. So it was really cool to spend a lot of time in it. So yeah, so a couple scenes stand out to me. One is, and then do you say a lesson, or do you say
I say a
Allison?
lesson. Yeah,
A
that's what I
lesson?
was
Okay, yeah.
saying.
So when a lesson takes on his wizard, that sequence was really, it stood out a lot because of the emotion, and he even has a performance, his pipe playing, that's tied
Oh
into that
yeah.
whole scene, that I thought that kind of stood out. So now I'm actually contradicting myself, because now that stands out, I'm like, well, of course, if a performance stands out for me, I should have understood why it stood out for you. So now I'm contradicting myself. But and then one of my favorite, I think the part of the book that I thought was perfect, that it's a small. This is one of those, I think, examples of a small plot point ties in the the mentality of the main characters, is when you have that scene in the pub, and then you find out who those two people are and why they did that. I was
Yep.
like, that is genius, because it's tying in the overall ending goal to the people who's going to be affected by it. And I was like, that was such an awesome idea, and I think a critical component of their mission in achieving their goal. So you get to see, like, they actually care about the people of Tigana and the people of the, was it South Palm or North Palm or something Palm, West Palm, East Palm, one of the palms.
One of the palms, yeah, or
Yeah.
one of the Cortes.
Yeah. How they, they truly cared about those people. And it's kind of a, and this doesn't spoil anything, but it's kind of, creating a preparedness in the people without them knowing. Super cool
Yeah.
aspect of the plot. So I loved that little scene. It stood out a whole bunch. And then yeah, so those are the two main things that stood out beyond some of the battles. And the Devin has a really cool part where you get to see, okay, can he handle himself? That's pretty. Is a pretty neat little part. And it wasn't perfection. That's a cool thing about the books, is not everything's perfect. Not everything ends exactly how it's supposed to end.
Yeah.
So like, this there's things that go wrong, and so it's pretty neat throughout the book too. But yeah, those two scenes really stuck out. Minus
cool.
in addition to the very very first scene in the cabin in the woods. The cabin in the
Yeah,
woods
which
scene.
you already mentioned that.
Yeah,
That
one
was an awesome scene.
It was really really good.
Did you end up having a favorite character by the end, or no?
So
I'm not sure if I do.
yeah, my characters I'm drawn to are really similar. So the kind of the how do I describe them? The ones who have the kind of allegiance to the good, and who are sacrificing themselves and their time for a good cause, I think I'm pretty easily drawn to. So a lesson in this case would be a person that I was kind of drawn to. He's imperfect, but every character's got to be imperfect to some degree. And I was gonna say, in similar, kind of the ones that have the sense of duty to the people, to, like, they're toppling the bad guy not out of revenge necessarily, but for the betterment of the people. And so in Mistborn, you read that Kelsier is kind of an example of that person.
Okay.
I haven't read too many other fantasy books, but there's probably that kind of the kind of natural leader, if you will.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm drawn to those characters quite a bit. And so, at least like in Mistborn, I was drawn to Kelsier, and this one I was drawn to a lesson, and so I like that sense of I don't know, self-sacrifice, as a duty to enhance the lives of those who are hurt by the powerful evil ruler.
Yeah. We even had another kind of side example of that with Rovigo, right?
Mm-hmm.
He kind of falls into that, right? I mean, like he
Yeah.
could have just not helped them.
Yeah. No, he does. He does kind of because yeah, he's kind of the an enemy of my enemy is a friend kind of thing. It's a
Yeah.
perfect example of that, and so he does fall into that. And you have you have the character I forget his name who was banished and then comes back, doesn't play as much of a role, but still is kind of
Oh,
he's one that stands for the
yeah.
old
What
way.
is their name? I can't remember their name either.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. I think
Uh,
that's
so is
you
it
get a lot of
is
that in
he
fantasy.
Sandre?
Yeah, I think it
Yeah,
is. I think it is.
because
Yep.
the wizard Senzio, right?
Yeah, that's yep.
So Sandre
You're
is the
right.
one that I think comes back. Yeah, that's he kind of he's almost like the old guard, and Alessan's the new guard.
Yep.
And so I liked that that interplay as well.
Cool. Well, I think we've talked about a lot. Do you have any other specific talking points that you wanted to make sure we brought up? I think I have
I have
exhausted all of my questions.
I have one question
Um,
for you,
okay.
and it may be hard, so I apologize. So you've read a lot of fantasy. Where does this rank?
In general,
Yeah.
uh, I have to think. Um, I don't think I've read enough GGK as an author to know where I would put him on my overall like list ranking of authors. But after reading just one of his books, there's promise that he could become like within my top 10 favorite authors because
Okay.
I was really swept away by this book. I don't think it would crack like my top 10 favorite books of all time,
What about
but
what about
it's
what about if you only compared it to other standalones?
to other standalones. This is one of the better standalones that I think I've ever read in
Okay,
fantasy.
that's fair because
Um,
series are hard to compare to standalones, I think.
yeah,
But if as far
no,
as
I
you
think,
compare to standalones, would it crack your top 10 standalones?
yeah, definitely because it's hard to write a really like it's hard to achieve all of the things that GGK achieved. Like we think about it in terms of one book. Yes, it's long. It was a long book. It was like what 700 pages, something like that.
Something like that, just sort of that.
Um, it's that's relatively short to achieve all of the things that I thought GGK was able to achieve. Like the way that he was able to make me think about this world, the way that he was able to draw me into caring about their cause, caring about the characters, caring about the consequences, caring about the effects of using like usually that can take like a trilogy to do.
Yeah,
And he was able to do that in 600-700 pages, which I thought was and tell a great story the whole time. Like I was hooked to this story. I thought it was a really cool concept. Um, and like you said, he didn't botch the ending. Like I thought the ending was great. I really enjoyed it. Like there was
right.
no aspect of this book left me feeling like, that was a little cheap, or like, he cut a corner there. Like, no, I didn't feel like that at all.
Yeah, I agree with
I
that.
was bought in. And a lot of times, like even in books that I love and authors that I love, I'm like, you know, I don't know about that little part right there. I never
Yeah,
had that moment in this book. There was like subplots and some of the storylines I wasn't as invested in or didn't care as much about personally, but I didn't think that they were poorly done. So yeah, this would definitely be like a top 10. I don't know exactly where in a top 10, but top 10 in standalones for sure.
maybe top 5.
Maybe top 5. Yeah.
Okay, I only asked that because I need a reference in case I recommend this to somebody to say, well, Colin's Corner suggests it's top 10 standalones, maybe even top 5. So I'm not just
You can quote me as yeah, you can quote me as saying that. I haven't read a ton of standalones.
yeah.
So it's something I'd like to do more of. It's hard to find them though, because a
You know
lot of
what's
fantasy
funny?
just ends up becoming series.
Ian, you know what's funny about this book is, and maybe you've noticed this too. I have seen this on a lot of people's TBRs, and um, and I've seen people a lot of times say, "Oh, I want to read that, but I haven't gotten to it yet." This seems to be like a book that's on everyone's radar but never gets read. And
I think
obviously,
GGK
the
is on a
road.
lot of people's TBRs, like as an
Yeah,
author in general.
and why do you think this? Primarily Tigana. I would say I have not seen many people talk about GGK without talking about Tigana. I've seen several. I think Ben had Tigana on his TBR. He hadn't gotten to it yet.
Mhm.
Talking Story, that guy said, John, I think said that he wants to get to Tigana. I'm not sure. I can't remember if, uh, well, Bearded Book Beast talked about getting to Tigana. Um, Britain at Samoki dude might. I don't think he's read
Oh,
Tigana
I
yet
love
either.
Britain, yeah.
Yeah, I think he might have this on his like radar as well. But lots of people have it on their radar, but just haven't read it. And I'm wondering, is it because it's a standalone and everyone's kind of just in so many series, they want to get through those first,
I
especially
think
with the
that
hype.
happens a lot with fantasy specifically because we are caught up in series almost
Yeah,
constantly. But I don't know. I think maybe like, and this is a personal. This is not like I'm not speaking for fantasy fans at large. But when you think of like pillars of the fantasy genre, um, typically I feel like that comes with the connotation that it should be prioritized more to
yeah,
get to. And while GGK is extremely well respected and enjoyed by those who read him, I don't think he's quite considered like a pillar of the genre, a must read of the genre to get
yeah,
the experience of fantasy, not like a Tolkien or more modernly like a Sanderson. So maybe that's why it doesn't get prioritized and
yeah,
kind of just gets like, oh yeah, I definitely want to get to that. And then I feel like the people that do try a GGK book, they become GGK fans. If they
yeah,
like enjoyed their first book, most of the people that I've talked to that enjoy GGK, they've read a lot of his stuff and plan on reading all of his stuff.
yeah,
So that's kind of my theory, but that's just my theory. I'm not speaking for the fantasy fandom at large.
yeah. Well, another thing I heard too that I was going to get your opinion on is a lot of people said that they either have read other GGK and consider this to be the case, or they can't wait to read GGK because they've heard of this. But they say that uh, his prose is really, really kind of top notch up there. I don't use the word prose a lot because I don't think I know enough and understand prose enough to actually accurately use that word. But I'll use writing style or write the way he writes. Did
Yeah.
you notice his writing standing out, against the backdrop of other fantasy books?
Yeah. I think there's a couple authors, and this is, I mean, subjective
Yeah,
to a certain
sure.
degree.
That's all it is.
Uh, yeah, this all is. Like I was telling you, like I even struggle sometimes, like labeling things book reviews because like I'm not an
Yeah,
authority figure. I'm not professionally trained in this
yeah. It's
at
like reading
all.
the
It's just like
tea
this is just a dude on the internet that has like a phone and access to like
That's so true.
post things online. But that's just semantics.
That's how
Uh,
we are.
I think that prose to me can not make or break, but can make something feel more personal. Like I love Robin Hobb's prose. The way that she writes speaks to me. Like it's a flow that I am comfortable with. I enjoy, um, and I think is beautiful. The way that she words things
Hmm.
can completely change the impact of an idea or of a
Sure.
sentence. And
Yeah.
I think that GGK has this sweeping, beautiful way of writing with a really robust vocabulary, like
Hmm.
some cool words that kind of almost play into the theme. In my opinion, it felt like this sweeping way of writing, and I'm being swept away into this fantasy world.
Right.
Like it felt magical. His writing felt magical, and that
Yeah.
is prose. Like the way that you write things.
Yeah.
Um, you know, obviously somebody writing a fantasy that's maybe based on medieval times, you can't use modern lingo. You can't use modern jargon. It will immediately take the reader out of
Yeah.
that suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
So I think the prose is important because it's part of the world building in a way, especially for fantasy. You can't use like modern slang,
Right.
or someone's gonna be like, "What the heck? Like, why would they
Yeah.
say that?" Like, that they wouldn't say that.
Yeah. It sounds out
So
of place, cheap,
yeah, right.
unreal.
'Cause yeah, everybody's read something like that. We're like, "What? Like, why would they say?" Or you're reading some writer that clearly like doesn't really understand kids or like adolescents, and
Hmm.
you're sitting there thinking like, I don't think a kid would say that, or
Yeah.
like a kid wouldn't act that way. Like, it takes you out of the story. So
Yeah.
I think all of those things can be considered, and authors do consider them when they're writing with prose, uh, specific styles, you know.
Yeah.
And I enjoy GTKs a lot.
Yeah. And I it didn't stand out to me because I don't think I've read enough other fantasy to compare it, but it did absolutely have an elegance to it that I could recognize, almost like the way he worded things and the way his characters talked about things matched their loyalties and their duties and the role they played in the plot, and then the
Yeah,
antagonists, right, the evil rulers, the way they talked and the way they described matched theirs. So it's kind of cool to see the way he wrote the characters matching kind of what they represented. So I thought that was good. I don't know if that's good prose or not, but that's kind of how I read it. And I do like, kind of the sophistication in the way in which he writes. But I completely agree with you on, and I'll kind of harp on a point you made that I think is absolutely perfectly nailing it, hitting the nail on the head, which is when people write characters of a younger age as if they're like 40-year-old mature adults, and you're thinking, no way would that 14-year-old kid have that thought
yeah,
and be able to say that and be able to act that way under pressure and all this kind of stuff. Um, and it really, yeah, it YA is, kind of one of those where you're thinking, 9-year-olds just are not that logical,
yeah,
and so it's one of those funny things. Well, YA would be, of course, a little bit older than that, but they might have characters in a family or something like that. But yeah, writing kids
yeah,
is tough, and then writing, I think also writing for me, we all have our own expertise and stuff, and so when people write professor characters, I'm extra critical uh,
as you should
because
be.
yeah, well, but I can still suspend my disbelief, so I can say maybe that's possible. It's not likely. It doesn't happen a lot. It doesn't occur quite often, but I guess it's possible that it could occur to someone at some point in time. And so I can still buy into books. When I read a book, I want to buy into it, and so I give um, a lot of favorability toward the author's attempt. And so if they make a pretty good attempt, I'll buy it, even if I see cracks, because a lot of
Yeah,
people will talk about some of the crime thrillers, how they're very unbelievable, and I don't argue against that. I think that that's probably true, but I'm okay with sometimes that happening, so that I can get to the end of the book.
yeah.
But if it is like you said, if it's too much, then it immediately pops you out of that suspension. You kind of have to do it again. You have to resuspend your disbelief, or reorganize your mentality to prepare you to get back into the story.
Which is like
Knowing
the last thing I would assume that an author wants to do. Like,
right,
you're trying to sweep somebody away in a story, and you don't want to knock them out and have to get them back in.
right, and you can do
So
that well though. Like you can do asides really well,
that's true.
um, but you have to do it well because those can just
Yeah.
plummet too. Um, But yeah, I just want to ask that writing question because I did see a whole lot of people talk about the beautiful prose of Guy Gavriel Kay, and I'm thinking maybe that's the case. I thought he wrote well, but I don't know if it's good prose or not because I cannot comment on that.
I would definitely consider it to be good prose. Um,
It was fun, that's for sure.
but it did stick out. Like, I remember thinking, like, man, he's a really good writer. Like,
Yeah,
he has command of the English language. He's doing what he wants to do.
yeah.
With
What's his? Do you know
um,
his background?
I know he's Canadian. That's the only thing I know about him, and he's written a lot of books.
Okay, yeah. It says
Aside from
he
that, I don't
was
know.
retained by the estate of J.R.R. Tolkien to work with Christopher Tolkien in the editorial construction of the posthumously published The Silmarillion. Sorry. So he evidently worked with Christopher Tolkien without really know what Christopher Tolkien's done.
Huh.
But.
That's pretty cool.
And the Silmarillion, is that a book pretty well known in the fantasy?
The Silmarillion is yeah, that's part of the Lord of the Rings lore.
Oh, okay.
Almost like a history book, kind of.
The classic fantasy I haven't read. So as I'm venturing into fantasy, I'm really kind of choosing at random. Tigana, because you and I, Mistborn, I read just because of all the hype. And then I read a Joe Abercrombie book. I read some other, but I haven't read the most talked about. So Lord of the Rings and Hobbit. I haven't read Harry Potter. I read one book in Harry Potter. I did read Chronicles of Narnia when I was a kid, or I listened to it on tape or something. And then I haven't read, where's some other really big names in like the kind of backdrop to most people's fantasy.
I think the Wheel of Time, a lot of people would consider the Wheel of Time a big one. I've not read the Wheel of Time.
I haven't read that either. There's another
Lord
series
of the Rings,
I'm missing.
Obviously.
Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. There's one other big series I feel like maybe it's Mistborn. I don't know. I feel like there's another one that's kind of like not new, but is a pretty common series people have read. But yeah, I know there's newer series that a lot of people are reading, like the Gwen series, of course, Joe Abercrombie's series,
Malazan.
Robin Hobb. I did read one of those. We talked about that. But yeah, that's another kind of big one. And then, some more popular recent ones. But I don't have the background reading fantasy growing up. I also don't have the background reading crime thrillers growing up. I didn't read a whole lot from 10 to 25. So I missed a lot. And
that's cool. You're not necessarily comparing to a lot of things and just kind of analyzing things as you go, which I think there's benefit to that too.
Yeah. And I can't really explain why I picked up reading again, but I think I have a lot of drives, and I think once I realize I can get books on CD and on my phone and turn an hour and a half drive into a couple hours of a story, because I kind of speed it up a little bit. Yeah. It makes things nice, and I realize I can get through stories quite quickly, and I found stuff that I like, and I like the trying to figure out, how someone's going to get caught or who did it or that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And the fantasy is pretty enjoyable because it is kind of fun learning about how things work in this new world. So it's a lot of fun.
Cool. Well, I'm glad you had a great experience with Tigana.
Yeah.
I had a great experience with Tigana and the Atlantis Gene as well. This has been overall a pretty fun experiment. So I'm glad that you reached out and that we were able to get together. It might have taken a little while, but
that's all right.
We finally got there.
That's right. And it all came crashing down on like 2 days.
That's true.
So it worked out. Big build up. But no, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Do you want to, before we end things, you want to just again remind people where they might be able to find you on the interwebs?
Sure. Yeah. The best place I'd say is Novel Insights is the name of my channel. My handle's at Dr. L_reads, and that's on YouTube. And the same handle for Twitter. But that's basically where you can find me. I like to do a lot of, I tell people I have kind of two mentalities or two versions of myself. I have the videos, which are a little bit more serious. That's kind of where I present what I think about books and things like that. And then I have my shorts where I basically just riff, have fun. But that's pretty much it. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. And I really appreciate it. And I've, gotten to know a few people, but doing a couple videos with you now, it's been a lot of fun kind of hanging out and getting to know each other and talk about some fantasy and some thriller books. And hopefully, we'll get around to doing something in the future. If we can do a buddy read or a book club read or something along those lines, because our discussions both have gone really well. And
absolutely.
Really so.
Well, thank you to those of you that did show up in the chat. And if you're watching this in the rerun, feel free to leave us a comment. I want to thank anybody who was here. Rogue says, which GGK are you playing? I don't have an immediate plan. If you have a recommendation, that would be cool. I know that I do want to read more. We talked about both of us wanting to continue in the Atlantis Gene series as well, but not knowing quite how big of a priority that was. I'm kind of like that with GGK. I have a lot of other plans, but I know I do want to read some more GGK.
Yeah, Rogue, make a recommendation if you got one. You said this is the most fantastical, so I'm interested to see what less fantastical books he's written.
The only other one that I'm thinking of I know is the Fionavar Tapestry. I've seen that. I know there's other ones that I can't think of right now that are pretty popular with GGK, but
has he written a whole bunch or has he written just a few?
He's written a decent amount of books, I think. I don't know exactly how many. I'm not very well versed in his entire catalog, obviously, or else I'd be rattling some names off. But I don't know. With that being said, I again want to thank Dr. L for being on here. Rogue, go ahead and leave us a recommendation in the comments. Thank you guys for stopping by to watch today. And if you're still here, I hope you guys are all enjoying what you're currently reading. And remember, you're always welcome in Colin's Corner.